In the summer of 1991, a young woman named Rosa Mendez stepped off a Greyhound bus in the small town of Clarksburg, West Virginia, with $47 in her pocket, a single suitcase held together by a leather belt, and a folded piece of paper with an address written on it in her mother's handwriting. She spoke almost no English. She knew no one in Clarksburg. The address on that piece of paper turned out to be a boarding house that had closed 2 years earlier. She stood on the sidewalk in the summer heat, suitcase at her feet, and looked at the unfamiliar street around her. She did not cry. She had not come this far to cry on a sidewalk. This is the story of what Rosa Mendez did next, and what Clarksburg did 30 years later, when it finally understood who she had been all along. Rosa had grown up in a small village outside Guadalajara, Mexico, the eldest of 6 children. Her father was a farmer. Her mother took in sewing and laundry. There was never quite enough of anything, but there was always enough love, and there was always enough determination. Rosa had watched her mother work from before sunrise until long after sunset every day of her life, and she had made herself a quiet promise. She would find a way to make things easier, for her family, for herself, for the children she hoped one day to have. A distant cousin had told her that Clarksburg was a good place, a small town with factory work and friendly people. The factory work turned out to be real. The friendly people turned out to be more complicated. Rosa found a room above a laundromat for $40 a week, which left her with exactly $7 when she first arrived. She got a job washing dishes at a diner called Pennies on Main Street within 3 days, not because anyone was eager to hire her, but because she walked in, pointed to the dishes stacked by the sink, and picked up a cloth and started washing before the owner could say a word. The owner, a tired woman named Patty, watched her for a long moment and then said, "6 in the morning, 6 days a week, $3.50 an hour." Rosa nodded. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood the tone. She was there at 5:50 the next morning, just to be safe. The early years were hard in ways that are difficult to describe to someone who has never been invisible in a room full of people. Rosa's English improved slowly, pieced together from menus, overheard conversations, and a worn English-Spanish dictionary she carried in her apron pocket. Customers at the diner rarely spoke to her directly. When they did, they spoke slowly and loudly, as though volume might bridge the gap that language could not. There were worse moments too. A group of men who came in on Friday evenings, who made jokes she was only beginning to understand. A landlord who raised her rent every few months, assuming she wouldn't know her rights well enough to argue. A neighbor who called the city to complain about cooking smells coming from her apartment, smells that were simply the food Rosa had grown up eating and that she made every Sunday to feel for just a few hours like she was home. Rosa said nothing to any of them. She simply worked. She sent money home to her family every month without fail. Even in the months when it meant she ate very little herself. She studied English at the public library on her one day off, sitting at a corner table for hours, moving her lips silently as she read. Within 3 years, she had saved enough to take a second job, cleaning offices in the evenings after her shift at the diner. Within 5 years, she had saved enough to take a small business course at the local community college, paying for it semester by semester with cash she kept in an envelope under her mattress. The other students in the course were mostly men in their 30s and 40s who were thinking about opening a hardware store or expanding a family business. Rosa sat quietly at the back and took notes on everything. In 1998, 7 years after arriving in Clarksburg with $47, Rosa Mendez opened a small alterations and tailoring shop on a side street near the center of town. It was tiny, just one room with 2 sewing machines and a curtained fitting area she had built herself from a rod and some fabric. She called it Rosa's. The first year was slow. She had no advertising budget and no connections. She survived on word of mouth and on the fact that her work was, by any measure, exceptional. She had learned to sew from her mother and her grandmother before that, and her stitching was the kind that people noticed without quite knowing why. Invisible and strong, the way the best work always is. Slowly, quietly, the town came to her. A bridesmaid dress that needed taking in the night before a wedding. A suit jacket for a job interview that needed new buttons and a proper press. School uniforms that had to last another year whether they fit or not. Rosa handled everything with the same calm, careful attention, and she charged fairly because she remembered what it felt like to need something done and not be able to afford it. She also began doing something else, something she told no one about. Once a month, Rosa set aside a portion of whatever the shop had earned and used it to cover alterations for families she knew couldn't pay. A woman whose husband had lost his job and whose children needed their winter coats let out. An elderly man who had lost weight from illness and whose trousers kept sliding off his hips. She never mentioned it. She simply handed the clothes back and said, "No charge this time," and moved on. By 2010, Rosa's had moved to a larger space on Main Street, 3 doors down from Patty's Diner, where Rosa had once washed dishes for $3.50 an hour. She employed 4 people. She had sent her youngest brother to university in Mexico with the money she'd saved. She had bought the building her shop was in, quietly and without fanfare, paying cash after years of careful saving. She had also, by this point, become a citizen of the United States, something she marked not with a party, but with a long walk alone through Clarksburg's small downtown, thinking about the woman who had stood on that sidewalk with a suitcase and $47 all those years ago. The neighbor who had once complained about her cooking smells came into the shop once to have a coat repaired. Rosa fixed it perfectly and charged her fairly. The men from the diner who had made jokes on Friday evenings had long since moved on. The landlord who had raised her rent arbitrarily had eventually lost his rental properties to tax debt and moved away. Rosa was still here. In 2021, 30 years after Rosa had stepped off that Greyhound bus, the Clarksburg City Council announced the recipients of the town's annual Community Builder Award, given each year to a resident who had made a lasting contribution to the life of the town. The name they announced was Rosa Mendez. What followed surprised everyone, including Rosa. Former customers came forward with stories she had never expected anyone to share. The woman whose winter coats she had let out for free wrote a letter that was read aloud at the ceremony. The elderly man whose trousers she had altered without charge stood up in the room and said simply, "She treated me with dignity when I had very little left." A woman who had gotten her wedding dress taken in at the last minute the night before her ceremony said she had never forgotten the quiet way Rosa had worked by lamplight until midnight to get it right, refusing to take more than her standard rate. The high school principal announced that Rosa had, over the previous decade, anonymously funded sewing and design equipment for the school's home economics classroom. Equipment that had been too expensive for the school budget for years. The city council presented her with the award and a proclamation naming the first week of September Rosa Mendez Week in Clarksburg. Rosa stood at the podium, dressed in a suit she had tailored herself, and looked out at the room for a long, quiet moment before she spoke. "When I came here," she said slowly, in English that was now as fluent and warm as her Spanish, "I had $47 and an address that didn't exist anymore. I was not sure I was welcome. Some days I was very sure I was not." She paused, but I stayed, because my mother taught me that you do not measure a place by how it treats you on the first day. You measure it by what you are both willing to become. She looked down at the award in her hands. "I'm proud of what I became, and I'm proud of what this town became too, even if it took 30 years. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet at all. After the ceremony, Rosa drove home, made herself a cup of coffee, and called her mother in Mexico, now elderly and frail but still sharp, still proud. "Mama, Rosa said. You remember that piece of paper you wrote for me? The address? Of course, her mother said. It was the wrong address, Rosa said. Her mother laughed, the same warm laugh Rosa had heard her whole life. I know, but you found the right one anyway. Rosa looked out her kitchen window at the street she had walked for 30 years, the same street where she had once been invisible and smiled. She had indeed. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the other story that may be appearing on your screen right now. It will most likely move you just as much. Have a beautiful day, and we'll see you in the next one.